Don't shoot, pleaded the train robber who recognized his own son behind the badge and the steady gun. When the masked train robber slowly pulled down his bandana, Deputy Samuel Cross felt his world shatter like glass in the desert sun. The face staring back at him wasn't that of a stranger. It was his own father, the man he believed dead for 23 years. Now, with innocent passengers trapped behind him and his duty sworn on a silver star, Samuel faced an impossible choice: arrest the father who abandoned him, or let love triumph over the law in a moment that would haunt the frontier forever. This is the story of when blood met steel under the burning New Mexico sky. The train's whistle cut through the morning air like a knife through silence, long and mournful as it rolled across the endless stretch of New Mexico territory. The iron horse moved steady and sure along the tracks, black smoke trailing behind it like the ghost of some ancient fire. Inside the passenger cars, folks dozed in their seats or stared out at the passing desert, watching the sun climb higher into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Frank Madsen sat his horse on a ridge overlooking the tracks, his weathered hands gripping the reins tight enough to make his knuckles white. The bandana tied around his face smelled of dust and old sweat, but it couldn't hide the lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too many choices he wished he could take back. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing the tension in his body, the way his muscles coiled like a spring wound too tight. Below him, the train rounded the bend, its brass bell catching the morning light like a golden promise. Frank's stomach twisted into knots. 23 years ago, he'd held his newborn son in these same hands, whispering promises about the kind of man he'd helped the boy become. Good hands, his wife Martha had called them. Gentle hands that could calm a frightened horse or rock a crying baby to sleep. Now those hands held a gun. The other men were already in position. Jake Morrison sat his horse near the water tower, his rifle resting easy across his lap. Tom Chun crouched behind the rocks that jutted up from the desert floor like broken teeth, his dark eyes fixed on the approaching train. And Billy Garrett, barely 19 and still thinking robbery was some kind of game, fidgeted with his pistol like it was a toy instead of a tool that could know life. Frank had tried to talk them out of it. Lord knows he tried. But when a man's got 3 children at home and no work to be found, when the bank comes calling about the mortgage and his wife's been wearing the same worn dress for 2 years running, well, sometimes a man finds himself making choices he never thought he'd make. The train was close now, close enough that Frank could see the engineer leaning out of the cab, his face red from the heat of the firebox. Close enough to hear the steady chuff, chuff, chuff of the engine as it ate up the miles. Frank's horse danced sideways, picking up on his rider's nerves, and Frank reached down to pat the animal's neck with a trembling hand. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or himself. He thought of Samuel then, as he always did when fear crept into his chest like cold water. His boy would be 23 now, if he was still alive. Frank hadn't seen him since the day he'd left home, hadn't even known if Martha had told the boy the truth about why his father rode away one morning and never came back. Maybe Samuel thought his daddy was dead. Maybe that was kinder than the truth. The whistle blew again, closer now, and Frank pulled the bandana up higher over his nose. His eyes were all that showed, and they carried 20 years of regret in their brown depths. He'd named his son Samuel after his own father, a preacher who died believing his boy would grow up to be something better than a common thief. Frank wondered what the old man would say if he could see his son now, sitting on a ridge with a gun in his hand and murder in his heart. But it wasn't murder he was after. Just money. Just enough to keep his family fed and his farm from being taken by men in fancy suits who'd never known what it felt like to watch their children go to bed hungry. The train carried payroll money, Jake had said. Money bound for the silver mines up north, where men broke their backs in the dark for wages that barely kept them alive. Seemed like justice, in a way, taking money from the mine owners who got rich off other men's sweat and blood. Frank tried to tell himself that, anyway. The train was almost to the curve now, where the tracks bent around the base of the ridge. Frank raised his hand, the signal they'd agreed on, and saw the other men tense up like hunting dogs catching a scent. His heart hammered against his ribs, so hard he was sure it would burst right out his chest. Then everything happened at once. Jake fired his rifle into the air, the crack echoing off the rocks like thunder. The train's brakes screamed against the rails, sending up a shower of sparks as the engineer fought to bring the iron horse to a stop. Steam hissed from the engine like an angry snake, and somewhere in the passenger cars, a woman screamed. Frank spurred his horse down the ridge, his gun drawn but not yet aimed at any living soul. The animal's hooves struck the hard earth like hammer blows, kicking up dust that tasted like copper and fear. Behind him, he could hear the others following, their horses breathing harsh and quick in the morning air. The train shuddered to a halt just past the curve, its cars swaying like a line of drunken men. Frank could see faces pressed against the windows, pale, frightened faces of people who'd probably never seen violence up close. A child's face appeared in one window, round eyes wide with terror, and Frank felt something twist in his chest like a knife blade. He forced himself to look away. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt," Jake shouted, his voice carrying clear across the desert. "This here's a robbery, plain and simple. Y'all just stay calm, and we'll be done directly." Frank rode alongside the train, his gun held low but ready. Through the windows, he could see passengers huddled in their seats, some crying, some praying, some just staring with the blank look people get when their world turns upside down without warning. An old man in a black suit clutched a Bible to his chest, his lips moving in silent prayer. A woman in a blue dress held a baby close, rocking back and forth like motion alone could keep them safe. The conductor appeared at the door of one of the cars, his hands raised high. He was a small man with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire spectacles, the sort of fellow who probably had grandchildren somewhere, who called him Papa, and climbed on his knee to hear stories about the places the iron horse had carried him. "Please," the conductor said, his voice steady despite the fear Frank could see in his face. "We got women and children aboard. Whatever you want, just don't hurt nobody." Frank's throat felt tight as a noose. "Open up the mail car," he said, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. "Just a mail car. We ain't here to hurt nobody." The conductor nodded quickly, relief washing over his features like water. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." Tom and Billy were already moving toward the mail car, where they knew the strongbox would be waiting. Frank stayed where he was, keeping watch, his eyes scanning the windows for any sign of trouble. Most of the passengers were still too scared to move, but he caught sight of one man near the back of the train who seemed to be reaching for something inside his coat. "Hey," Frank called out, spurring his horse closer. "Keep them hands where I can see him." The man, middle-aged, soft around the middle, wearing the kind of clothes that spoke of money and comfort, slowly raised his hands. In one of them, Frank could see the glint of metal. A derringer, small but deadly at close range. "Drop it," Frank said, his gun now pointed at the man's chest. "Drop it, and nobody has to die today." The man's hand shook as he let the little gun fall to the floor of the car. "I got a family," he whispered. "Wife and 2 daughters back in Denver. Please." Frank felt that familiar twist in his chest again. "Then go home to them," he said quietly. "Go home and hold them tight, and don't ever take a day with them for granted." Behind him, he could hear Tom and Billy working on the strongbox, their voices excited and urgent. Jake kept watch from his position near the engine, his rifle ready. Everything was going smooth as silk, just like they planned. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something in the air, maybe, or the way the desert seemed too quiet all of a sudden. He'd lived on the frontier long enough to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him like a prairie fire alarm. Then he heard it, the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, coming fast. His blood turned to ice water in his veins as he saw the dust cloud rising from the south, too big and moving too fast to be anything but riders. A lot of riders. "Jake," he shouted, "we got company coming." Jake's head snapped around, and Frank saw his own fear reflected in the other man's eyes. They all knew what this meant. Somehow, someone had known about the robbery. Someone had sent word ahead, and now the law was coming down on them like the wrath of God. "How long we got?" Jake called back. Frank squinted at the approaching dust cloud, trying to judge distance and speed. 5 minutes, maybe less. Tom. Billy. Forget the damn box. We're leaving. But Tom was stubborn as a mule when he got his teeth into something, and Billy was too young to know when to quit. Frank could hear them still working at the strongbox, cursing and prying with their tools like they had all day instead of minutes. The hoofbeats were getting closer now, close enough that Frank could almost make out individual horses. His own mount was getting nervous, tossing its head and dancing sideways. The animal could smell trouble coming, same as Frank could. Tom. Frank rode toward the mail car, his voice harsh with urgency. Leave it. We gotta go now. Tom's face appeared in the doorway of the car, sweaty and determined. Almost got it, Frank. Just another minute. We ain't got another minute. But it was too late. The riders crested the ridge to the south, and Frank's heart stopped beating for one terrible moment as he saw the flash of silver stars on their chests. Deputies. A whole posse of them, led by a man Frank didn't recognize. Young, with dark hair and strong shoulders, riding like he was born to it. The young deputy raised his hand, and the posse spread out in a line, their horses moving with the discipline of men who knew their business. Frank could see the determination in their faces, the grim set of their jaws. These weren't town drunks playing at being lawmen. These were serious men who'd come to do serious work. This is Deputy Samuel Cross, the young man shouted, his voice carrying clear across the desert. Y'all are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender. Frank's gun fell from his nerveless fingers and hit the ground with a sound like a breaking heart. Samuel, his son, his boy, grown into a man with their father's strong jaw and their mother's kind eyes, wearing a silver star and pointing a rifle at the men who'd raised him from a baby. The world tilted sideways, and Frank had to grab his saddle horn to keep from falling off his horse. 23 years collapsed into nothing, and suddenly he was holding a tiny baby again, counting 10 perfect fingers and 10 perfect toes, whispering promises about the future they'd build together. Samuel didn't recognize him. How could he? Frank was just another outlaw with a bandana over his face, just another desperate man who'd chosen the wrong path. But Frank would have known his son anywhere, in the way he sat his horse, in the careful way he held his rifle, in the quiet authority that seemed to flow from him like water from a spring. His boy had grown up to be exactly the kind of man Frank had always hoped he'd be. Strong, honest, brave enough to ride toward danger instead of away from it. Everything Frank had once been and could never be again. The irony of it cut through him like a blade forged in hell itself. Here he was, pointing guns at innocent people and stealing money that wasn't his, while his own son rode with the law to stop men exactly like the man Frank had become. If there was a God in heaven, he surely had a sense of humor darker than a moonless night. Frank's hands shook as he reached for the bandana covering his face, then stopped. What would happen if Samuel knew? What would it do to the boy to learn that his father wasn't dead or disappeared, but had been alive all these years, choosing crime over family, choosing the easy path over the right one? Maybe it was better this way. Maybe it was kinder to let Samuel keep believing his father was gone than to show him what Frank had become. The other members of the posse were getting closer now, their circle tightening like a noose. Frank could see the determination in their eyes, the way they held their weapons with the confidence of men who knew how to use them. These weren't the kind of lawmen who would hesitate to shoot if they had to. And at their head rode Samuel, his rifle steady and sure, his eyes scanning the scene with the careful attention of a man who'd learned that one moment of carelessness could be the difference between going home to supper and never going home at all. Frank's heart swelled with pride and broke with shame all at the same time. This was his son, his blood, his legacy, and Frank was about to become the man Samuel would have to kill or capture to do his duty. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert floor, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out to its mate with a sound like loneliness itself. The silver star on Samuel Cross's chest caught the morning sun like a mirror, throwing light across the desert in small, dancing pieces. He rode at the head of the posse, his horse's hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth, each step bringing him closer to something he couldn't name but felt deep in his bones. A pull, like iron drawn to a magnet. Behind him, 5 good men followed without question. Men who'd ridden with him before, who trusted his judgment and his aim. Sheriff Williams had handpicked every one of them when a wire came in about the train robbery. "Take Cross," the sheriff had said, his weathered face serious as Sunday. "Boy's got instincts like his daddy had. Nose for trouble and the sand to see it through." Samuel had never known his father. Not really. Frank Madsen had left when Samuel was barely old enough to walk, disappearing one morning like smoke in the wind. His mother Martha had remarried when Samuel was 7, and Thomas Cross had been the only father Samuel could remember. A good man who'd raised him like his own blood, taught him to ride and shoot and look a man in the eye when speaking truth. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Samuel wondered about the man who'd given him life. Martha never spoke of him, and Samuel had learned not to ask. Some doors were better left closed, she'd said once, her eyes distant and sad. Some ghosts were better left to rest. The tracks stretched ahead of them like a scar across the earth, 2 parallel lines of steel that caught the light and held it. Samuel could see the smoke from the train in the distance now, a black smudge against the blue sky that meant they were close. His pulse quickened, but his hand stayed steady on the reins. He'd been wearing a badge for 3 years now, long enough to know that steady nerves saved lives while hot blood spilled them. "How many you reckon we're facing?" asked Pete Hawkins, riding up alongside Samuel. Pete was older, closer to 40, with gray in his mustache and the careful way of moving that came from taking bullets in places that never quite healed right. "Wire said 4 men," Samuel replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Could be more, could be less. Won't know till we see them. Think they'll fight." Samuel considered this. In his experience, desperate men did desperate things, and train robbery was about as desperate as it got. Probably. Men don't rob trains planning to surrender peaceful-like. Pete nodded and fell back in a line. Samuel could feel the weight of command on his shoulders, heavier than his gun belt, heavier than the badge on his chest. These men were following him into danger because they trusted him to bring them home alive. It was a responsibility that sat in his stomach like a stone, cold and hard and permanent. The desert around them was alive with small movements. Lizards scurrying between rocks, birds calling from hidden places, the whisper of wind through sagebrush. Samuel had grown up in this country, learned to read its moods and seasons like other men read newspapers. Right now it felt expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm, charged with something waiting to happen. His horse, a bay gelding named Ranger, suddenly raised his head and nickered softly. Samuel felt the animal's muscles tense beneath him, the way they did when Ranger caught scent of something that didn't belong. Samuel trusted the horse's instincts more than his own sometimes. Animals knew things men missed, felt dangers that human eyes couldn't see. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, patting the horse's neck. "What is it you're smelling?" But he thought he knew. Gun smoke, maybe. Fear sweat. The sharp smell of metal and trouble that hung around desperate men like a cloud. Samuel had learned to recognize it in his 3 years of wearing the star, had learned to trust the way it made his skin prickle with warning. The sun was climbing higher now, hot enough to make sweat run down Samuel's back beneath his shirt. The desert didn't forgive weakness, didn't show mercy to the unprepared. Samuel had seen men die of thirst within sight of water, seen others freeze to death on winter nights when the temperature dropped like a stone into hell. This land demanded respect. It took payment in blood from those fool enough to think they could master it. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace, and Samuel found himself thinking about his mother's stories. She used to tell him that hawks were messengers, carrying news between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Foolish talk, maybe, but growing up in the territory taught a man to listen to old wisdom, even when it came wrapped in superstition. The bird let out a cry, sharp and wild, and Samuel felt something cold walk up his spine. He'd heard that sound before, on the morning Thomas Cross had been killed trying to stop a bank robbery. The hawk had circled then too, crying out like it was mourning something that hadn't happened yet. Samuel shook his head, trying to clear away the dark thoughts. This was just another job, another group of outlaws who'd chosen the wrong side of the law. He'd face them down, same as he'd done a dozen times before, and then he'd ride home to the little house on Maple Street where Martha would have supper waiting and stories about her day at the Church Ladies' Auxiliary. But the cold feeling wouldn't leave him alone. They crested a low rise, and Samuel could see the train clearly now, a long black snake stretched across the desert, smoke still rising from its stack. Even from this distance, he could tell something was wrong. The train sat too still, like a dead thing in the sun. No movement, no sound of the engine working, just silence that felt heavy and full of trouble. Samuel raised his hand, and the posse slowed to a walk. No point charging in blind when you didn't know what you were facing. Better to take time, study the situation, make a plan that wouldn't get good men killed for no reason. Through his field glasses, Samuel could make out figures moving around the train. For men, just like the wire had said, though it was hard to tell much more at this distance. They were mounted, which was good, meant they hadn't had time to dig in and fort up. Mounted men could be surrounded, cut off from escape routes, forced to surrender or face overwhelming odds. One of the figures caught his attention. Something about the way the man sat his horse, the set of his shoulders, struck Samuel as familiar. But that was impossible. Samuel had never seen these men before, never crossed paths with train robbers in his 3 years of law work. He was letting his imagination play tricks on him, seeing ghosts where there were only strangers. Samuel. Pete's voice was quiet, respectful. What's the play? Samuel lowered the field glasses and considered their options. The train was stopped in open ground, with no cover except for some rocks scattered along the track. If they came in hard and fast, the outlaws might panic and start shooting passengers. If they came in too slow, the robbers might have time to finish their business and run for the hills. We circle around, Samuel decided. Come at them from the south, use the sun at our backs. Spread out in a line, give them plenty to think about. Maybe they'll see sense and surrender without blood being spilled. And if they don't, Samuel's hand moved to the rifle scabbard beside his saddle. Then we do what we came to do. The men nodded and began to spread out, each finding his position in the line they'd practiced 100 times. Samuel felt a moment of pride watching them work. Good men, steady men, the kind you could count on when things turned ugly. Thomas Cross had taught him that a lawman was only as strong as the men beside him, and Samuel had chosen his posse with care. But as they rode closer to the train, that cold feeling in Samuel's chest grew stronger. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, felt personal in a way he couldn't explain. The desert around them seemed too quiet, too still, like everything was holding its breath and waiting for something terrible to happen. Samuel touched the badge on his chest, feeling its weight and warmth from the sun. Thomas Cross had pinned the first star on his shirt, right there in the sheriff's office with tears in his eyes and pride in his voice. You'll do right by it, the old man had said. I can see it in you. The same thing that makes a man stand up when others sit down makes him walk toward trouble instead of away from it. Samuel hoped he was right. In a few minutes, he'd be close enough to call out to the robbers, close enough to see their faces and count the guns in their hands. Close enough to find out if today would end with handshakes and justice served, or with gunfire and blood soaking into the desert sand. The train grew larger ahead of them, and Samuel could make out individual cars now, could see faces pressed against windows, frightened faces of people who'd started their morning thinking about breakfast and ended up staring down the barrel of outlaw guns. Innocent people who deserved to go home to their families tonight, who deserved to see their children grow up and their grandchildren born. That's what this was about, Samuel reminded himself. Not glory, not proving anything to anyone. Just making sure good people could sleep safe in their beds, knowing that someone stood between them and the wolves that prowled the darkness looking for easy prey. The distance closed to 100 yards, then 50. Samuel could see the outlaws clearly now, could see the tension in their bodies, the way their horses danced with nervous energy. One of them, the leader, Samuel guessed, sat perfectly still, like he was carved from stone. Something about that stillness made Samuel's chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. 20 yards now. Close enough to see the details, close enough to count the lines on weathered faces and read the fear in desperate eyes. Close enough to call out his warning, to give them one last chance to choose surrender over violence. Samuel opened his mouth to speak, to offer them the mercy of the law instead of the justice of lead and powder. But the words died in his throat as the outlaw leader slowly reached up and pulled the bandana away from his face. Time stopped moving forward and started moving backward instead. 23 years in the space of a heartbeat, and Samuel found himself staring into eyes he knew as well as his own reflection. The world became a photograph, frozen in silver light and shadow. 20 feet of desert dust stretched between father and son like 20 years of silence. And in that space hung every question Samuel had never asked, every prayer his mother had whispered in the dark. Every night Frank had lain awake, wondering if his boy was safe and warm and loved by a better man than he could ever be. Samuel's rifle trembled in his hands like a living thing, the barrel wavering between earth and sky as his mind tried to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. The face staring back at him carried lines that hadn't been there in the old daguerreotype his mother kept hidden in her Bible. Deeper grooves around the eyes, gray threading through hair that had once been dark as coffee, a scar along the left cheek that spoke of hard living and harder choices. But the eyes were the same, brown as river stones, sad as Sunday evening, filled with a love so deep it hurt to look at. Samuel. The word fell from Frank's lips like a prayer, barely louder than the whisper of wind through sagebrush. He said it the way a dying man might say water, with a thirst that went all the way down to his bones. Behind Samuel, the other deputies shifted in their saddles, sensing something had changed but not understanding what. Pete Hawkins cleared his throat softly, a sound that might have been a question or a warning. The moment hung between them all like smoke from a dying fire, beautiful and terrible, and gone too soon. Frank's hands were empty now, his gun lying in the dust where it had fallen when recognition struck him like lightning. He sat perfectly still on his horse, as if moving might break the spell and send his son riding away forever. The bandana that had hidden his face dangled from his neck like a hangman's noose, and his breathing came short and shallow, the way it did when a man was trying not to cry. "You grew up strong," Frank said, his voice thick with 23 years of unsaid words. "Just like I knew you would. Just like your mama said you would." Samuel's throat felt like he'd been swallowing sand. The rifle in his hands suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds, too heavy to hold but impossible to lower. This wasn't how he'd imagined meeting his father. Not across the sights of a gun, not with innocent people trapped between them, not with the law on one side and outlaws on the other like some terrible joke God was playing on them both. "You're supposed to be dead," Samuel whispered, and even as he said it, he knew how foolish it sounded. Frank was sitting right there in front of him, real as the sun overhead and the dust beneath their horses' hooves. Real as the pain that was spreading through Samuel's chest like poison in his veins. Frank's smile was the saddest thing Samuel had ever seen, full of love and regret and the kind of weariness that came from carrying guilt for too many years. "Maybe I am, son. Maybe I died the day I rode away from you and your mama. And what's sitting here now is just a ghost who don't know enough to lie down." The other outlaws were watching now, confusion written across their faces as they tried to understand why their leader was talking to the deputy like they were old friends. Jake Morrison's hand had moved closer to his gun, and young Billy Garrett looked ready to bolt like a spooked horse. Only Tom Chun remained perfectly still, his dark eyes moving between Frank and Samuel like he was watching a play unfold and waiting to see how it ended. Samuel felt the weight of his badge against his chest, hot as a brand in the desert sun. Thomas Cross had taught him that the law was like a river. It flowed in one direction, steady and sure, washing away everything that tried to stand against it. Good men and bad men, rich men and poor men, they all got swept along by the same current in the end. The law didn't care about your reasons or your regrets or the love you carried in your heart like a stone. But this wasn't some stranger he was facing down. This was the man who'd given him life, who'd held him as a baby and sung him lullabies in a voice that sounded just like Samuel's own. This was the ghost he'd been chasing all his life without knowing it, the shadow that had followed him through every choice he'd made and every path he'd walked. Why? The word tore itself from Samuel's throat like barbed wire. Why'd you leave us? Why'd you let us think you were dead? Frank's horse stepped sideways, sensing his rider's pain, and Frank reached down to pat the animal's neck with a gentle hand. The same hands that had once held Samuel, that had taught him to tie his shoes and braid rope and load cartridges without spilling powder. Hands that were shaking now like leaves in a winter wind. Because I wasn't good enough, Frank said, and his voice carried the weight of every sleepless night, every choice that had led him further down the wrong path. Because you deserved better than a man who couldn't provide for his family, couldn't keep food on the table or a roof over your heads. I thought if I left, maybe your mama could find someone who could give you the life I never could. She did. The words came out harder than Samuel meant them to, sharp as knife blades. Thomas Cross was a good man. A better man than. He stopped himself, but the damage was already done. Frank nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this. I'm glad, son. I'm glad she found someone who could love you both the way you deserve to be loved. That's all I ever wanted. Then why? Samuel's voice cracked like a boy's, and he hated himself for it. Why are you here? Why are you doing this? Frank looked toward the train, where frightened faces still pressed against the windows, where the conductor stood with his hands raised and his eyes wide with fear. When he looked back at Samuel, there was something broken in his expression, something that might have been shame or might have been the kind of desperation that drove good men to do terrible things. Because a man's got to eat, son. Because I got 3 little ones at home who ain't had meat on their table in 2 months, and a wife who's been patching the same dress for 3 years running. Because the bank's coming to take what little we got left, and sometimes a man finds himself choosing between his pride and his family survival. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. He'd grown up comfortable, safe, loved by a man who'd been able to provide for them all. He'd never known real hunger, never watched his children go to bed with empty bellies while he sat helpless and ashamed. The law was clean and simple when you'd never had to choose between right and wrong with your family's lives hanging in the balance. There's other ways, Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Honest ways. Are there? Frank's laugh was bitter as alkali water. You tell me, son. Where's an aging cowhand supposed to find honest work when the big ranches are bringing in their own men and the small ones are going under? Where's a man supposed to turn when he's got willing hands and a strong back, but nobody wants what he's selling? Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard the same complaints in town, seen the same desperation in other men's eyes. The territory was changing, growing civilized, and not everyone was finding a place in the new order. Some men got left behind, forgotten like abandoned homesteads slowly crumbling back into the earth. But that didn't make this right. That didn't change the fact that innocent people were sitting on that train, afraid for their lives, while men with guns took things that didn't belong to them. Samuel's duty was clear, written in the silver star on his chest, and the oath he'd sworn when Thomas Cross first pinned the badge on his shirt. I can't let you do this, Samuel said, and the words felt like they were being pulled out of him with pliers. I can't let you ride away. Frank nodded again, like he'd expected this too. I know, son. I know you can't. You're a good man, better than I ever was. You understand what duty means, what it costs to do right even when right feels wrong. The sun was directly overhead now, beating down on them like God's judgment, making the air shimmer with heat waves that turned everything soft and dreamlike. Samuel could hear his heart beating in his ears, loud as thunder, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle blew, lonely and mournful, like it was mourning something that hadn't died yet. "I don't want to fight you," Samuel said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't want to fight you either, son." Frank's hand moved slowly toward the gun on his hip, not threatening, but ready. "But I got children at home who are counting on me. I got promises I made that I ain't ready to break." Samuel understood then that this wasn't going to end with talk. It was going to end the way these things always ended in the territory, with smoke and lead and blood soaking into thirsty ground. One of them would ride away from this place, and one of them would stay forever, becoming just another story people told in saloons on quiet nights when the wind was blowing cold. The rifle in Samuel's hands felt heavier than ever, but his grip on it was steady now. Training took over where emotion failed, muscle memory guiding his movements as he brought the weapon to bear. Across from him, Frank was doing the same, his own gun clearing leather with the smooth motion of a man who'd practiced the draw 10,000 times in 10,000 lonely campfires. For a moment that lasted forever, they faced each other across 20 feet of dust and 20 years of silence. Father and son with guns in their hands and love in their hearts, and no way to bridge the distance between law and desperation, between duty and survival, between the men they'd chosen to become. The desert held its breath, waiting to see which would prove stronger, the bonds of blood or the weight of justice, the love of a father or the oath of a lawman, the past that had shaped them both or the choice that would define them forever. In that endless moment before the shooting started, Samuel found himself wondering if this was what his mother had meant when she said some doors were better left closed, and whether the man who'd sung him lullabies was about to become the man he'd have to kill. Time moved like honey in winter, thick and slow and golden, as Samuel stared down the barrel of his rifle at the man who'd given him life. The desert sun beat against his back, but inside his chest everything felt cold as a mountain stream in January. His finger rested on the trigger, and 23 years of questions hung in the air between them like dust motes dancing in the light. Frank's gun was steady in his hand, pointed not at Samuel, but at the ground between them, like he couldn't bring himself to aim at his own blood, even knowing it might cost him everything. The other outlaws had gone quiet, sensing something bigger than a simple standoff playing out before their eyes. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in a silence so complete it hurt to breathe. "You don't have to do this, Pa." The word slipped out before Samuel could stop it, and it tasted strange on his tongue after all these years. "Put the gun down. Surrender. I'll speak for you at the trial. Tell them about your family, about why you—" "No, son." Frank's voice was gentle but firm, the way it used to sound when Samuel was small and asking for something they couldn't afford. "You got your duty, and I got mine. My children are depending on me to come home with enough money to keep the wolves from the door. I can't let them down. Not again." Samuel's heart twisted like barbed wire in his chest. He could see it now, could picture the little house somewhere with peeling paint and holes in the roof, 3 children who looked like him sitting around a bare table waiting for their father to come home. A woman, not his mother, but someone who loved Frank anyway, mending clothes by lamplight and trying to make nothing stretch far enough to fill empty bellies. "There's got to be another way," Samuel said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. He'd seen enough of the territory to know that desperation wore many faces, and sometimes good men found themselves choosing between their souls and their family survival. "I could help. I could find you work, honest work." Frank smiled, and it was the saddest thing Samuel had ever seen, full of love and regret, and the kind of weariness that went bone deep. "You're a good boy, Samuel. Better than I deserved. But it's too late for that now. Way too late." Behind Frank, Jake Morrison was getting restless, his hand hovering near his gun as he watched the strange drama unfold. Young Billy Garrett looked ready to bolt, his horse dancing sideways with nervous energy. Tom Chun remained still as a statue, but his eyes were watchful, calculating. The stolen money was still in the mail car, close enough to touch, but far enough away to feel like a dream. Samuel felt the weight of his badge against his chest, hot as a branding iron in the desert sun. Thomas Cross had taught him that the law was bigger than any one man, bigger than family or friendship or the ties that bound hearts together. The law was what kept civilization from sliding back into the darkness, what protected the innocent from the wolves that prowled the edges of the campfire light. But the law had never felt so heavy before, never felt like it might crush him under its weight. "I'm sorry, son," Frank said quietly. "Sorry I wasn't there to teach you to shave. Sorry I missed your first day of school. Sorry I never got to see you grow into the fine man you've become. But I ain't sorry for loving my family enough to do whatever it takes to keep them safe." The words hit Samuel like physical blows, each one finding a tender place in his heart that he'd thought was healed over. He could see Frank 23 years ago, younger and full of hope, holding a baby and making promises about the future they'd build together. Could see the moment when hope died and desperation was born, when a good man realized he wasn't good enough and chose to walk away rather than watch his family suffer. "It doesn't have to end like this," Samuel whispered, and his rifle wavered in his hands like a compass needle, searching for true north. "Yes, it does." Frank's voice was steady now, resigned. "Some stories only got one ending, son. Some men only get one chance to do right by the people they love, and I already used mine up when I left you and your mama. This here's my second chance, and I ain't gonna waste it." Samuel understood, then, that his father had already made peace with whatever was coming. Frank had ridden out this morning knowing he might not ride home, knowing that desperation had finally backed him into a corner where the only choices left were bad ones and worse ones. He'd chosen to face his son across the sights of a gun, rather than watch his other children go hungry. The train whistle blew again, mournful and distant, and Samuel thought about all the passengers inside those cars. Mothers and fathers and children just like Frank's, just trying to get from one place to another, just trying to live their lives without being touched by violence. They were his responsibility too, part of the oath he'd sworn when he pinned on the star. "I can't let you take that money," Samuel said, and his voice cracked like a boy's. "You know I can't." "I know," Frank replied, "and I can't go home empty-handed. Not with 3 children looking at me like I'm some kind of hero, like their daddy can fix anything and make everything right. I already failed one son. I won't fail the others." The words cut deep, deeper than Samuel expected, opening wounds he'd thought were scarred over. He'd spent years telling himself he didn't need Frank, didn't care about the man who'd walked away when times got hard. But standing here now, seeing the pain in his father's eyes, he realized that part of him had been waiting for this moment his whole life, waiting for Frank to come back, to explain, to ask for forgiveness. Instead, he'd gotten this. A train robbery, a standoff, a choice between duty and blood that felt like it might tear him in half. Samuel's hands were shaking now, the rifle heavy as a tombstone in his grip. Behind him, he could hear Pete Hawkins shifting in his saddle, waiting for orders, waiting for Samuel to remember he was a lawman first and a son second. The other deputies were good men, but they didn't understand what was happening here. To them, Frank was just another outlaw who needed to be stopped. But Samuel could see the truth in his father's eyes, the love that had never died, the regret that had eaten at Frank's soul for 23 years, the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, he could still be the man his children needed him to be. Frank wasn't just a criminal. He was a father, a husband, a man who'd made terrible choices for reasons that made perfect sense when you were looking at them through the lens of love and desperation. "Please," Samuel whispered, and he wasn't sure if he was talking to Frank or to God or to the desert wind that carried prayers to places where they might be answered. "Don't make me do this." Frank's smile was gentle now, full of the same tenderness Samuel remembered from the few clear memories he had of early childhood, bedtime stories and gentle hands, and a voice singing lullabies in the darkness. "You're doing right, son. You're being the man I always hoped you'd become. Don't let my failures change that." The sun was starting its long slide toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Soon it would be evening, and somewhere 3 children would be waiting for their father to come home with food and hope and the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. Somewhere a woman would be watching the road, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that might never come. Samuel felt the weight of all those expectations, all that love and need and desperate hope, pressing down on him like a mountain. The badge on his chest seemed to burn against his skin, reminding him of his duty, of the oath he'd sworn, of the innocent people depending on him to stand between them and the chaos that always lurked at the edges of civilization. But Frank was his father, blood of his blood, bone of his bone, the man who'd given him life even if he hadn't been there to guide it. That had to count for something. That had to mean something in a world where meaning was as scarce as water in the desert. "I love you, son," Frank said quietly, and the words carried 23 years of silence, 23 years of regret, 23 years of a father's heart breaking a little more each day. Whatever happens next, don't never forget that. Don't never think you weren't worth staying for. I left because I loved you, not because I didn't. Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger, and he knew that in the space of a heartbeat, he would have to choose between the law he served and the blood that ran in his veins, between justice and mercy, between the man he'd sworn to be and the son he'd never stopped being. The desert held its breath, waiting for the choice that would echo through the rest of Samuel's life, waiting to see if love could find a way to triumph over duty, or if duty would prove stronger than the bonds that connected fathers to sons across all the years and miles of mistakes that tried to keep them apart.